Okay, very good.
Okay. Okay. So as you might see, some of us have logged in from our classroom spaces. So you see one name, and in reality, there are multiple people listening to you at the same time. So a very good morning, Rüdiger Görner, and a very good afternoon to those in the afternoon space, maybe from India or other parts of the world. It is a very happy occasion. I am really happy to be a part of this book discussion on a recently published biography of the polyglot, the globetrotter, and most widely translated author Stefan Zweig. And the book has a very, very interesting polychronic title, In the Future of Yesterday, A Life of Stefan Zweig by Rüdiger Görner, published by House Publishing, London. So thank you for joining this conversation, Rüdiger Görner, and thank you, Daisy Wilkins of House Publishing, for co-organizing this event. Hearty congratulations, Rüdiger Görner, on the most recent feather in your already colorful cap, uh, Friedrich Gundolf Prize, that was conferred by the Deutsche Akademie für Sprache und Dichtung for your decades-long contribution to building literary and cultural bridges between the Anglo-Saxon world and the German-speaking intellectual spaces. Would you like to maybe begin by underlining the significance of this book being written in English? I mean, those who know you also know that you are a polyglot, a professor of German and comparative literature, and you have a very impressive list of publications also written in German. So why this book in English?
Thank you, Swati, and thank you for welcoming me to this wonderful group, far away as far as I'm concerned from here, but very close to me and also to a particular interest that Stefan Zweig indeed connected with your country, with India. To your question, I think I would like to say that the biography was really written for a Anglophone readership in that sense, to also present Zweig more directly in a cosmopolitan context. And English, after all, is the language that facilitates this transcending of borders in a more obvious fashion. The other reason for that was to acknowledge that Zweig, after all, spent a considerable amount of time in the Anglophone world as an exile, but also as someone who, from a very early on, was interested in, shall we say, the Anglophone cultures. And this had to do with his very first visit to London back in 1906, which to a certain extent introduced him also to this Anglophone cosmopolitanism of the time in London, and obviously also brought him in contact to a certain extent with aspects of Indian culture as well that was discussed there and then. Let's not forget that it was Zweig who was extremely interested in W.B. Yeats. And Yeats, of course, was known as an Irish poet, as the Irish poet of the time, to have a real interest in Indian culture. He, after all, is one of the people who was responsible eventually for Tagore to receive the Nobel Prize.
Excellent. We can only be happy about it because, as you rightly pointed out, it suddenly opens to a large readership who may or may not be able to read Zweig in the original German language. What really impresses any reader who reads this book, that there is a continuously running thread of restlessness And you use a very beautiful term, Angstlust, which captures a very unique spirit of that restlessness. And it is like a desire to chase a more fulfilling life, long to see a better version of oneself, and followed by incessant, and literally incessant travels across continents, reflecting a daringly different world view, Weltanschauung, as one may call it in German. So, do you want to actually comment as a biographer through your approach to dealing with a life as complex and as interesting, as intriguing, like that of Stefan Zweig, uh, that he still holds so much of relevance? I mean, his World of Yesterday, his title of his own autobiography, is actually being reflected in your biography in a way like for our world of today.
Yes, indeed. I think the world of yesterday, from Zweig's perspective, when he wrote his autobiography in exile, at first in the United States, um, is a world of security, as he put it. That is to say, the Vienna of 1900, the Vienna right up to the First World War, was, from his perspective, a world of security, of safety, of reliability. And I dare say that we also, certainly in the West, Western Europe, we were used to a world of relative security up to now. And that world is changing rapidly. And I think what makes Zweig so relevant for today, apart from his humanist stance, apart from his sheer interest in the cosmopolitan experience, which we of course do share and want to share to the very day, what makes him interesting is this transition he experienced during the First World War and after the First World War immediately, from security to a scale of insecurity that he does reflect. And it is true, of course, that Zweig was the restless traveler already before the First World War. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been traveling to India, for example, and other countries. He was a dedicated Francophile, apart from anything else. France and Belgium are countries of his early destinations in terms of what he did as a writer and in terms of actual experiences. But what interests me most, and I think this is what the biography tries to respond to, is this extraordinary transition that we, of course, experience nowadays from a sense of reliability to a sense of problematic developments on a world scale. I dare say, if we talk about the relevance, the so-called relevance of Zweig today, one has to be careful, of course. It is impossible to, shall we say, apply Zweig's experiences to what we have today on a one-to-one basis, as it were. One always has to put a question mark when one compares between, especially such diverse epochs in history. But the one thing that Zweig probably would not have imagined, that the White House would in fact be the instigator of a very new and completely and utterly unknown scale of insecurity. Because from his point of view, whatever we might say about Zweig's attitude towards the United States, but he was critical of the States even when he went there as an exile. But the one thing that he believed in, and his great contemporary Thomas Mann, of course, was that at least you could rely on the democratic principles of the United States. which, as we all know, are now at risk. And that is something which I dare say comes to all of us as a surprise. And it would have come to Zweig also as a surprise. I dare say so.
I couldn't agree more, because given the sensitive mind that Zweig had, he wouldn't have been just surprised, but probably also devastated at the scale of insecurity, as you pointed out, being created, generated, and multiplied in many forms. I mean, in financial terms, in border controls, everything. Well, but precisely in this kind of an insecure world, what probably offers a little security, at least provisionally, as a provisional security, is one takes a refuge in maybe the world of and realm of literature, culture. So, in that context, I would like to come back to your book and refer to it as a composition with a good reason, because Zweig himself had a passion for music, and those who know you also as a poet and a musicologist of a kind. You have had some training in the music studies. And Zweig was himself an eloquent and ardent biographer. I mean, he has written biographies of many a stellar personality in the European world, but also of many biographical essays on Tagore, Dickens, Balzac, and Dostoevsky, etc., etc. What is fascinating about this book is that you take the readers with an ease of an expert who can, explain the strokes, the textures of the paints, the light, or the notes in a symphony. I mean, I was continuously traveling between two media, the painting and the music. And what is extremely interesting to an audience like this, who are mostly students and scholars of German studies as such, that you introduce the reader also to a parallel contemporary world at that time. So that is journey through cities like Paris, London, Moscow, Vienna, above all, and Brussels, etc., etc. And there are so many names which just come, and it is like cultural history of Europe at the time. So, would you please comment on your approach as a biographer and how you dealt with Zweig as a biographer of all important people that he wrote on in creating a cosmopolitan consciousness and the European spirit? I mean, I was so impressed by the word, the expression that you use, Eurosceptic. Zweig comes across as a Eurosceptic, and how you chose to highlight certain things of his life, because your approach is really very different. I mean, that's very striking right from the beginning. It is not a biography of run of the mill kind. It's a very special biography which tells you about so many biographies of cities as well as people. So thank you for doing it for us. And maybe you could just help us more by uh, elaborating a little more on your approach of remembrance, as you yourself call it.
Thank you for that, Swati. It is indeed true that a particular challenge for this biography was to write something about the life of a biographer, which, of course, as you pointed out, Zweig was. When we think of his masterstrokes as a biographer, Marie Antoinette, Mary Stuart, also Fouché, Erasmus of Rotterdam, these are texts which obviously epitomize a interest on Zweig's part in figures that represent not just an era, but they represent particular thoughts. In the case of Erasmus, very obvious humanism. In the case of Mary Stuart, the hope, as it were, to gain power, to gain influence as a female at the time. And let's not forget also his stories, his novellas, his one completed novel, but also the non-completed novel. They are about the female psyche. And this is what interests him immensely. The female psyche that he also feels was somewhat present in the emergence of the idea of Europe. After all, Europa is a female. We shouldn't forget that. And he is keen to point out, shall we say, the dimensions of the female psyche, but also the suffering that the female was subjected to, not just in his time, but basically throughout history, as far as he was concerned. At the same time, yes, you're right. I do point out that he was critical of, shall we say, a Europe that would inspire ideological thought. This is one of the reasons why he is vehemently against pan-Europeanism. He is against all sorts of isms. He is an anti-ideologue par excellence. And this makes him, from my point of view, eminently appealing, because he questions the purpose, he questions the stance of ideologies, basically right from, not the start, but right from the end of the First World War. This is when he realizes that ideologies, in particular nationalism, have led to an unspeakable catastrophe in the First World War. And this is for him the trigger to say, let's not pretend that the idea of Europe should be codified as an ideology. Hence, he criticizes the spokesman of pan-Europeanism in his days, Count Kudnow-Kalergi, a very interesting figure by all means, but someone who wanted to somehow define Europe as a new form of ideology, the Europeanism. And it smacked of some form of new way of perhaps also colonialism. And this is something that Zweig is very critical of, because he realizes that Europe is a lively entity, is based on, yes, you would say nowadays, multiculturalism, is defined by not creating new borders, but actually trying to re-eliminate them, so to speak, because Zweig is used from his experience as a young man prior to the First World War, that you travel around Europe without passports. Suddenly you had the nation state demanding a specific form of identification. He was appalled by that, quite clearly, as he was appalled by customs officers, for example. Yeah. Okay, we might see this as rather idiosyncratic on his part and perhaps too idealistic on his part, but perhaps it wasn't too idealistic after all, because if we experience nowadays the, shall we say, re-erection of borders at literally all levels, one is, I dare say, well advised to have a closer look at what Zweig had to say about this problem and this issue. But my main point here really is, be it nationalism, be it Bolshevism at the time, be it capitalism, any ism is, from his point of view, perilous.
Mm-hmm. Yes. As you already mentioned that Zweig was really a global author already in his times, and something that very few authors could dare to do in his times was a voyage to India. And his interest and engagement with India, you rightly call that chapter Passage to India. I mean, that is another very beautiful thing about your writings, not only in this book, but in general, that it is a really rich lesson in intertextuality. One simply has to pick up the correct threads and know what what all is embedded in it. So coming back to his interest in India, I mean, we all know it's a very well documented sojourn to India in 1908 and 1909, very well written texts on important cities in India. And of course, it is at that time that Zweig looks at Indian cities from the religious perspective, from the spiritual perspectives, etc., etc. His text on Banaras is, for example, even today, a continuous and constant part of many a syllabi on seminars like German speaking literature on India, etc., etc. And as we all know, he was one of the, not one of the, but probably the most widely and happily translated authors all over the world. So there are many translations of Zweig's texts done in many Indian languages. There are theatrical adaptations which were very successful, done by renowned playwrights and theater directors. I remember one, that of the play, The Augen des ewigen Bruders. Dekh Rahe Hain Nain, that was the title, and produced and directed by a very, very well-known director, Habib Tanveer. So Zweig is known in India. How do you, as a, and one of course has sometimes uh, little controversial opinions about Zweig's interest in India and how he focused only on a particular stream and did not take into consideration the colonial aspects of Indian reality at that time. But that can be a separate topic to discuss. How do you see Zweig's interest in India, considering also what he did for Rabindranath Tagore in Europe? I mean, we all know that he hosted Tagore in Salzburg in 1920 and was very enthusiastic about his participation in various events in Europe. So, how do you see, as a biographer, Zweig's interest in India?
I think his interest in India is not in that sense ambiguous. I dare say, and what you're saying is very illuminating in terms of the reception of Zweig today in India. At the time, it is remarkable that he writes in a very illuminating way about India, not just in terms of reports on cities and this and that, but also about the political situation in India. And what interests him is, as he once calls it, the Indian danger for England, a most remarkable article, which I find telling because it somehow encapsulates what he perceives in India as the real issue. And it is, in fact, his realization that England is totally and utterly unaware of the specific interests that the Indian people have. And what he describes as the danger of India for England is that he predicts quite clearly an uprising against English colonialism. And that, I have to say, in 1909 is quite extraordinary for an Austrian observer of this situation. And he clearly deplores a, shall we say, rule for India that is imposed by a European power. Now, it is controversial whether this is solely based on his own insights or whether he had simply very good informants who were even better placed to report about this or inform him about this. The most likely candidate, this goes a little bit into detail, but I think it's worth it. The most likely candidate for this kind of informer for Zweig was actually a German, was the military attaché to Japan, Karl Haushofer, who spent a great deal of time in India and clearly knew the situation from firsthand pretty well. In my biography, I refer to a parallel development around 1909, namely the young Mahatma Gandhi, of course, begins to understand the significance of what self-rule for India would really mean. Um, at the same time, when you ask me how do I approach this from a biographer's point of view, and also from the point of view of a European, I have to say that what struck me was not so much E.M. Foster's novel Passage to India, which is much later, 1924, but Walt Whitman's poem, The Passage to India, as you all know, that I think is something that not only Zweig was aware of, he was an avid Walt Whitman reader, and Leaves of Grass was certainly something that he knew. Incidentally, like the aforementioned Thomas Mann, also a very keen reader of Walt Whitman. What I think Zweig took from Whitman was indeed already at this time the interest in a decolonized India. And I think the way in which Zweig mobilizes all his, shall we say, verbal skills to depict the colorfulness of this continent, to depict the, yes, indeed, multicultural interaction in India. All of that has clearly the purpose of showing to a German readership that India could very well stand on her own. And this was clearly a stance that also Haushofer, his potential informant, took at the time. But of course, we have to be careful when we talk about a military attaché and his view of India from a German perspective. That was, of course, also an anti-British slant that this German military attaché attached, probably, to his comments on India at the time. The other cultural interest that I think was a genuine one by Zweig is the Indo-Germanic connection. Now, of course, we all know that this Indo-Germanic connection was very often misused, certainly on the German side, for nationalistic purposes. This is a hallmark that you can't find in Zweig at all. He really looks at the Indo-Germanic connection from a romantic point of view. I would not say that at the time he was aware of Friedrich Schlegel, for example, who, as we all know, in the Romantic era, established this kind of link, like other German linguists, Hans Bopp and others, and of course, to a certain extent, also Wilhelm von Humboldt. But that aside, it is simply that Zweig is looking for, dare I say it, affinities between German culture and Indian culture. And there he finds Tagore really his key witness. Again, as you quite rightly say, he is the one who does a lot to propagate Tagore's reputation in the German-speaking countries. And he, however, takes this from W.B. Yeats. Yeats was certainly the one who was more intimately familiar with Tagore than Zweig was. Nonetheless, Zweig writes about him. Zweig suggests, particularly to his publisher, Kippenberg, that Tagore must be present in German language as well, simply because the sheer attitude of this writer somehow mirrored, in Zweig's view, the position of the ideal German poet, as it were, because he would be, in a sense, a more plausible cultural leader, again in inverted commas, as you know, in Germany, we always have to put the word leader in inverted commas for good reason. The poetic leader is precisely the figure that Zweig identifies in Tagore. The poetic leader, incidentally, is also a concept and a conception that is not necessarily always nationalistic by any means. My prime example here is Max Komarell. And Max Komarell is perhaps a name that is not so familiar to everyone here, but Max Komarell was a very important literary scholar who wrote a very important study, very influential study on the poet as leader, published in 1931. This is important. 1931. This is before the Third Reich commences, and the ethos of Komarell to attach some form of cultural leadership to individual poets is precisely the kind of thing that had already inspired Zweig a decade earlier to identify Tagore in such a role. So this is, from my point of view, an important reason why he was so interested in him.
That's very, very enlightening, because that was exactly the reason I wanted to know your approach. Because, I mean, one can easily imagine he was not someone like Hesse, for example, that his interest in India was very clear and very one-sided, so to say. But Zweig was different, and thank you for your explanation. Now, I would really like to come to this aspect of Zweig's literature, and Zweig being almost like a magnet to translators from all over the world. I want to believe that maybe somewhere his own approach to the linguistic identity of every individual as a pluralistic, a pluriverse-oriented identity could be one of the reasons, because as we all know, he was not only a polyglot, but he also was aware of the power of languages as such, languages and thereby cultures and other cultural significant aspects of every human life. Because he was himself not only a translator, but he was also a very keen mediator. I mean, through your book, we got to know, or I got to know, how he worked hard to get Romain Rolland's Jean Christophe being translated in German was so important to him that he kind of, undertook great efforts to do that. So how would you see in today's world? I mean, today one would think that the world has come closer and all those old cliches have no longer, they no longer cast the same spell as they used to in the beginning, global village, etc., etc. But do we want to believe that translation as a very conscious activity can still be harbored in order to build, create, shape bridges between cultures, languages, human lives, so to say? And I ask this question particularly to you, not only because you are a biographer of this wonderful book, but you are also a polyglot. You have worked a lot in so many languages. So, how do you see the translator as a creator of cosmopolitan awareness?
I think this is a very important and a very significant question, especially in our time as we speak, more or less, and we find that AI systems take over the role of the translator. And I think we have, unfortunately, we have to add to our discussion precisely that point. Nowadays, we hardly have any, shall we say, meeting of translators without the question, what does AI do to us as a profession? The pessimists amongst us, I think both of us, we don't belong to this category, but still, the pessimists amongst us, they would argue, yes, AI will take over and makes the translator redundant. I think it is ultimately our decision what we are going to do about this whole situation, which is precarious at best of times. But we need to be aware what type of task we associate with AI. If we really think that a translation of Tolstoy is better dealt with by AI, I dare say we give away one fundamental element that certainly Zweig associated with his own translations, as you point out, and with translation as such, and this is the humanist value. Because the act of translation, the act of translating, is in many ways an essential aspect of human interaction. Artificial intelligence is a useful tool for some areas of our existence, but there is no need, in my view, to hand over literally everything to these kind of digital functions and facilities. Yes, we do not necessarily need a technical translator to produce a manual for Hoovers. That's perhaps not so important. AI can do that fine. I have no problems with that. But I have a serious problem when it comes to literary texts of quality that are fed into a digital system, and the ultimate result is then presented to us as an authentic translation. It is inauthentic by definition. It is inauthentic. So your question, I think, pertains quite clearly to a fundamental issue that translation has always attracted in terms of comment. Certainly since the days of Goethe and immediately after. It has something to do with cosmopolitan awareness being live. There is life in translation. And this is why we have so many versions of one important book, for example, because that one important book is alive. And this liveliness, these variants, they are great. It's wonderful to have different, sometimes poor, sometimes phenomenal translations of one and the same text. It just demonstrates how, it may also demonstrate the incompetence of the translator, but that's a different matter. But it also demonstrates and reflects the inner variety of an ambitious literary text. And we don't have to deal that much in depth with lesser significant texts. They are written and they're forgotten. But when it comes to ambitious texts, I dare say that, for example, what Zweig did himself to promote translations, not just to translate himself, but to promote translations or to review new translations. In his time, famously, the first translation of Ulysses by James Joyce into German. I make this point in this biography. The most spectacular, by Stefan Zweig standards, the most spectacular review, I dare say, he has ever written. It is a review of a translation almost as an experiment in writing reviews. Most fascinating, where he first of all starts by saying, no one really understands Ulysses. It's impossible to understand it. And then in this lengthy review, he changes his tone bit by bit until he credits the translation to an extent that he says, okay, here we encounter something totally new in terms of writing. And this in itself demonstrates just the broadness of his perspective on foreign languages, on styles of writing, because James Joyce's Ulysses has absolutely nothing to do with, shall we say, the style of his own writing, Zweig's own writing. But he is, as it were, big enough to embrace this and to say, look here, it's amazing what this Irishman is doing. And this is transmitted, relayed through a fairly experimental form of translation at the time. And this is what he propagates. This is what he's open for, and he's opening up the reader's mind in that direction. And I think this is a particular fascination, which he also did, for example, with his own translations of Emil Verhaeren. You see, one of the reasons why I'm adamantly against the word globalization or global is because globalization doesn't have this vibrancy that we have in cosmopolitanism. It would be interesting to identify when it really was that we departed from the word cosmopolitanism and embraced globalization, because you can say that certain functions have been globalized, or certain, shall we say, economic developments have been globalized. You can't say that things have been cosmopolitanized. That would sound awkward and awful. But this form of a cosmopolitan, shall we say, cultural understanding of the world somehow encapsulates this liveliness that, in my view at least, we do have in many, not all, but in many of Zweig's writings.
Thank you. Thank you for this very optimistic explanation and upholding the human agency in the act of translating, because I can actually imagine so many from the audience who are listening to you also go through this confusion. What happens now? What does AI do to us as, let's say, somebody who's now on the threshold of entering the professional area, and how do we compete with this unknown AI? Maybe it is a good idea now to open some questions from the audience. I would generally just encourage everyone to ask questions about Zweig, about anything that was directly and indirectly mentioned right now in this conversation. So either you just switch your camera on or raise a hand. There are multiple technical avenues to let us know that you have a question.
Not all as once, as they say.
Exactly. So it generally takes a little while to
Sure. No, but
change roles
from
active listeners to active speakers.
Who is the first?
Who's the first? That's always the question. Maybe by the time others are formulating a question, I would like to just know, maybe this is also a question that deals with little information. One reads in your biography that Stefan Zweig had a very ambitious project, Bibliotheca Mundi, in collaboration with Insel Verlag. So what that project really was, and do you think something like that can be envisaged even now? Because the descriptions sounds magnificent. I mean, something to realize Goethe's ideals of world literature, and through that idea to create, once again, to use the same word, cosmopolitan consciousness. So what was it? Do you think it is replicable?
I think it is. It would depend on many factors, of course. It would depend on publishers who are willing to engage in such a colossal project. I think the problem was that it was defined right from the start just for a German audience. Insel Verlag in Kippenberg started this process, but of course nowadays we would want to see this on a larger scale and with international publishing houses being involved in this. I would suggest that there was a project between several publishing houses of different languages in countries where they invited writers of all denomination to recount or re-narrate familiar myths. That, I think, was a very fine project, and it seems to me that the Bibliotheca Mundi today would need probably a touch more focus and would need perhaps a particular theme or themes. It would need probably also more input from contemporary writers. Zweig had envisaged not necessarily contemporary writers to be part of this, but to go into the literary tradition, fair enough, at the time also a more realistic approach. But nowadays, I dare say the involvement of contemporary writers would be significant, would be of interest. And again, it would depend on themes, it would depend on who is funding such projects. But I mean, it's a UNESCO, it would be a classical UNESCO undertaking, for example. I mean, we have just now, the other day, as we all know, we've just lost one of the, in my view, great writers, Lagos Lossa, someone who was in many ways, after Marquez, spokesman for Latin America, and politically engaged, of real interest in literary terms. I mean, what more do you want? Someone like him, and of course there are still others, someone like him would have been an ideal figurehead, as it were, for such a project. It's always difficult to do these things in memory of, but in this case, I think it would be interesting to do, to engage in such a, yes, UNESCO project, why not? Under the heading of, in memory of very significant, recently died world authors. I mean, from Doris Lessing to Lossa and what have you. So that would be a possibility, in my view. However, it would need some organization, but I dare say that UNESCO could play a significant part in this.
Yeah, that should be possible, and that maybe will bring together people from different countries to work on a common project. Because to have something common, in spite of having other differences of origin, of languages, etc., is maybe the need of this hour. And one can bring people together.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, it is also a response to an increasing and deeply worrying development of self-censorship that happens now in East and West and North and South, where writers, journalists in particular now, are cautious, not to say afraid, of saying what they want to say. And this is in many ways a negatively global phenomenon. And there, I think, the still free voices of writers, they have a very important role to play in a truly cosmopolitan sense of the word. And self-censorship is certainly something that you won't get from Stefan Zweig at all. That was never his thing. He was always ready. In the midst of the First World War, he wrote and actually had the opportunity to perform a play that advocated pacifism called Jeremiah, and it was first performed in Zurich in 1916-17. So this is someone who was able to speak up. And let's not forget, it was also in 1917 when Stefan Zweig published, I think to the surprise of many, in the most important newspaper at the time in the Austrian sphere, the Neue Freie Presse, an extraordinary review of Henri Barbu's pacifist novel, Le Feu, The Fire. And that was possible in 1917, when the First World War was still, raging. That this was possible in Vienna, I think, is remarkable, but again, is a measure of Zweig's courage. So there was, as you quoted at the beginning, there was Angst, Lust on his part, for sure, yes, but it was counterbalanced by this remarkable courage that he displayed as well.
Absolutely. And I think if one knows what kind of... now there is a question. So before I comment, I would like to give this... Mr. Görner, Stefan Zweig's memoir, The World of... One second, we'll open the chat. Yeah, Professor Görner, Stefan Zweig's memoir, The World of Yesterday, and the movie focusing on his exile, Farewell to Europe, both carry titles that evoke a sense of loss and perhaps reflect the deep pessimism and despair Zweig experienced. In contrast, your biography is titled In the Future of Yesterday, which seems to hold a more optimistic or forward-looking perspective. Was this a conscious decision to counter the prevailing sense of melancholy associated with Zweig's final years? And if so, what specific aspects of his life and work led you to frame his legacy in this futuristic light? This is a question by a young colleague in Pune teaching German, Gitanjali Kanade.
Absolutely wonderful question, and it was worth waiting for this question. Marvelous. Thank you for that. Yes, the answer is yes. It was a conscious decision not to write the Zweig biography solely from the perspective of his suicide and the suicide of his second wife, Lotte Altmann, but to demonstrate that there is a development that, in fact, and I say this in the book as well, where you have phases, of course, of pessimism, where you have phases of depression, where we have a young man who is contemplating at some stage suicide, or at least toying with the idea of it. And at the same time, the prevailing force in him is something that should not be just judged on the, shall we say, on the finale, as it were, on the tragic finale, where he was indeed in deep despair about the situation of the world. I'm far from denying this, but I wanted to demonstrate and to show that there is much more to Zweig than this ever discussed reason for his suicide. I don't even want to go into this. I make a few suggestions in the book, but that's not so significant. Ultimately, we never know precisely why somebody decided to take his own life. There are so many factors that contribute to this. Certainly in Zweig's case, there were very many factors. He felt that there was an impasse at the end. There was a kind of end he couldn't escape. The self-chosen exile in Petropolis. He didn't stay in the United States for reasons that had something to do with his criticism of shall we say, US capitalism, commercialism, etc., etc. He couldn't cope with that. The reason why he went to Brazil has something to do with his 1936 book on Brazil, the country of the future. You see, this is what I mean when I refer to this. The world of yesterday, Vienna, Austria, Habsburg, before the First World War, is, from his point of view, counterbalanced by his admittedly idealized view of Brazil of 1936 that he visited for the first time then, and identified again this multiculturalism that he felt was at work in Brazil as something that, yes, to a certain extent he had experienced also in India in his early days, it was, from his point of view, even more pronounced in Brazil. And this he regarded as a potential model for a future. We all know that the Brazil at the time was not exactly an ideal state. It was a dictatorship by any standards. And yes, we have to say that Zweig generously overlooked this to a certain extent and made excuses. But there is no way that there's no evidence at all that he wrote this book, Brazil, the Country of the Future, on behalf of the government, as some biographers have claimed. There is no evidence for this whatsoever. There is evidence, however, that he wanted to find a retreat, ultimately, which he found in Petropolis, but he somehow couldn't foresee that this retreat became a trap at the end for him. And that, of course, is the final tragedy in his life, no question about it. But let's not forget, we have right to the end, just this is weeks before his suicide, we have wonderful letters from him writing to his, or rather to Lotte's family, where he just comes back from the carnival in Rio de Janeiro, and he was uplifted. He felt this was wonderful experience. But ultimately, it was not enough, because the one thing he really feared, was that Hitler Germany would really win that war, and fascism as a concept, as a perversion of ideology, would win the battle. And that he felt he couldn't live with. I think that we can say. That, for example, Thomas Mann in his diaries reproaches him, as it were, for his step that he had taken, is a different matter. I am the last person to say that Zweig's decision to take his own life, and Lotte Altmann's decision to take her life with him, was a capitulation in that sense, was a betrayal of his fellow exiles. This is such a personal phenomenon, a personal decision, that I think generalizing this point would be very difficult. But I hope I have managed to answer your very important question, very good question, halfway adequately.
Thank you, Gitanjali. And considering the time limit, I don't see any urgent question popping up here.
May I?
Yes, Libin John. Yes, please.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much for organizing such a wonderful discussion for us, Swati ma'am. And good afternoon, Professor Görner. Mine is more of an observation. I'm very passionate about literary translation. You rightly put it that AI tools cannot replace, in any case, any of the translators who do literary translation, because you need that human emotion, that human touch, which the AI is deficient, it doesn't have. Yeah. And secondly, you kindle that fire in me to either read your biography that you've written, and if time permits, to translate it into German or into English or Hindi, or any of my languages, and read more and more about Stefan Zweig. Thank you so much.
My great pleasure. Thank you so much for your comments. Most kind. Thank you.
Yeah, and then there's a hand raised by Libin John.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Görner, it was really very interesting to hear to you. And in fact, I have not read much on or from Zweig. So it's an opener for me. And since I'm also very closely looking at the intellectual development in Austria in the 19th century, towards the later part of the 19th century. So I was just curious, because Zweig had grown up in what we call the Siècle, Vienna, right? The turn of the century. So this is also the time when, you say that, Austria is basically can be, I mean, the Austrian intellectual thought is characterized by the linguistic skepticism and a kind of more empirical, turn to understanding the reality vis-a-vis the German one, which is more ideal and rational and all that. So I was just wondering, I mean, how Zweig would be responding to these what we tend to call quite Austrian questions, right? And then, and I also see that Zweig has traveled a lot, and he has been in a, I mean, it seems to me like a certain search for the other, and therefore by creating a certain, what this civilizational, sort of spirit rather than the culture, So there is also, I feel, a certain tendency to overcome Zweig's own, cultural, context. So I just would like to, hear your comment on that.
Thank
How
you.
we sort of.
Yeah, thank you for that. Indeed, Zweig is somehow removed from, shall we say, a skeptical attitude towards language. He, to put it crudely, he simply loves language. And the skepticism that you have from the Prague School, for example, is not his, not at all. And at the same time, what we do find is a difference between, shall we say, in poetry, between Stefan Zweig and, shall we say, Hugo von Hofmannsthal. Hofmannsthal is much closer to this form of skepticism, as you know, towards what we can really express in terms of emotions, in terms of any form of objectivity in language. Your second point, equally important, yes, it is true that Zweig is at first, right up to, I would say, 1905-ish, he is still interested in the question of Austrian identity. There is an early essay by him claiming that the Austrians have no proper identity at all. They're sort of amalgamating themselves with this huge thing called the Habsburg Empire, but they don't really know who they are. That is formulated by the very young Stefan Zweig as a criticism of his culture. This changes. Eventually, he will argue that this is actually a forte, this is a strength, that they don't have such a rigid identity. We have a similar attitude towards Austria at the time by, for example, Hermann Bahr, a name you may have come across. Of course, Hugo von Hofmannsthal is also, after the First World War, still preoccupied with the question of what Austria really represents. And you're right in assuming that Zweig makes a deliberate decision to branch out, to literally leave Austria, not completely leave it behind him, but somehow spread his wings. And these wings he spreads predominantly towards France and Belgium. That's what interests him at first. Eventually then in a much more cosmopolitan fashion. No, he's not the only one, of course not. I mean, we also have, of course, a Hugo von Hofmannsthal traveling eventually to Egypt and what have you. But this is not with the same motivation that we have it in Zweig. Zweig, I dare say, to put it somewhat provocatively, he escapes. He is escapist when it comes to the real nuts and bolts of Austrian identity. He loses interest in that to a certain extent and only recaptures this interest when he lives in exile, when he remembers his childhood, when he remembers the early years in the security of Vienna then. You may know Hilde Spiel's beautiful account, Vienna's Golden Autumn. that is one of the finest reflections of a Viennese, ultimately also in exile in the 1930s, Hilde Spiel's study on Vienna in the fin de siècle. And you have exactly this kind of reflection of Vienna being the epicenter of cultural movements, as it were, that surrounded the imperial city, but also penetrated it. And she calls it the Golden Autumn. Yes, indeed, because what came later was a very harsh winter. And the harsh winter certainly sets in after the death of Franz Josef in 1916. And then, of course, the end of the First World War, where you have mass starvation, etc., etc. This is something which Zweig somehow, even in the world of yesterday, he tries to not camouflage it, but try to escape from all of this. And admittedly, he is very familiar with, for example, with Switzerland in already during the First World War, as said. And he's interested in the European idea as a surrogate for the lost Habsburg idea. Yeah, this is a kind of parallel movement that we get in him. And these are the things that preoccupy him certainly throughout the 1920s. And I dare say Zweig in the 1920s is fascinating also as a political figure, even though he doesn't want to be one, but he can't help being one. And he is quoted by left and right and what have you, and the bourgeoisie, as a potential witness for their opinions. Yeah? But he has so many, and he's a bit of a maverick, let's be honest. He's a bit of a maverick when it comes to a clear political stance in the 1920s. He's interested in Judaism, of course. I mean, his Jewish origins matter to him a great deal, but he is very skeptical about Zionism. That is not his game at all. He's not a Zionist. He knows one of the founding fathers of modern Zionism, Theodor Herzl, but he doesn't subscribe to Zionism because it is a ism, and he doesn't like that. He doesn't like an idealization, or rather the ideology of a particular conception. Yeah, that's where he would depart from. That's not his thing. So you find him forever trying to find also an inner equilibrium of all these tendencies that he embodies in many ways. He is a man of many identities in so many ways. An attempt of an answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. There is one last question. I see a hand raised by Lena Hartl. Lena is currently interning in our department. She's from the University of Vienna as our Austrian intern. So unfortunately, Lena's question will be the last question. Considering the time limit, we have something as the next event planned after this. So Lena, may I ask you to request you to formulate your question as precisely as possible. Lena, bist du da? I saw her hand. Was that? Was that an AI hand? I don't know.
You can hear me. Sorry.
Now you can
hear me. Okay. She's there. Yes, please.
It's not even that much of a question. I just wanted to say thank you also, because I've been very moved since Die Welt von gestern was really a book. I mean, I was born and grew up in Vienna, and after reading this book, I think at the age of 17 maybe, I saw the city which I grew up in with different eyes. So I'm very fond of it and happy I read it. Just one question I have, or I remember that it also occurred to me even when I read it, was just this kind of Verträumtheit in describing a world which was still, women could not yet vote, and Vienna was there was so much poverty also. Like the working class was living under the worst conditions. Like, I don't know, it was for very few a very like golden time or glorious time. And I was just wondering if, I don't know, if there's been voices, I don't know, critical voices about this, or if there's a take on that. But in general, thank you very much for the
Fine. Yeah, Frau Hartl, the point is that, of course, our Stefan Zweig was not a social historian. And I think we have to accept this. Yes, of course, there has been considerable criticism of his depiction of the world of yesterday, no doubt, no doubt. But I think the position that he writes from and writes about is, as you quite rightly say, a privileged one, no question. This is someone who is the son, who is the offspring, with his brother, of course, of a very wealthy textile merchant, textile producer. This is a bourgeoisie that, of course, has no parallel in the majority of Viennese at the time, as you quite rightly say. This said, it is true that he is, for example, very interested in Bertha von Suttner. He is interested in the female that, I wouldn't say resist their conditions, but the female that takes to action. Schwarzwald, for example, Eugenie Schwarzwald, he points out as a really important educator. That is to say, through education, through pacifist activity, he does credit the female of the time without really exploring, absolutely right, without exploring their genuine social conditions. The working class is certainly, or classes, is certainly a backdrop to a certain extent for his considerations. He is slightly different in his talk, which is quite remarkable. His talk on Vienna, which is the last talk that he gave in the European continent, literally weeks before the German army occupies France. He's the last to give a public lecture in Paris on Vienna, as it was. And it is absolutely true what you say. This is not the Vienna that you experienced or that you remember in terms of what you've read about, you know, the social strata of Vienna around 1900. But it is, to a certain extent, an expression of hope, yet again, of hope, that something from this essence of the Viennese privileged culture might radiate into all stratas of society. I think this is his real desire. And his emphasis is always on education, that only through education could the lower classes, as it were, be emancipated. But thank you for your concern and question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rüdiger Görner, for this absolutely delightful conversation. And so many of us are encouraged to possess a copy of our own. That is a great news. Thank you, everyone in the audience who participated so actively, and I'm sure the takeaways are rich. And we look forward to maybe your next book. Why not? Thank you so much, Rüdiger Görner.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.